This video wants to illustrate my argument about the pigeon controversy in Trafalgar Square as an example of Bruno Latour's movement of translation. Through translation, we go about creating our world, a world that we like to think is purely and exclusively human when it is actually made of all sorts of participants. Michel Calon, in an article published in 1986 about farming scallops techniques in France, has examined more in detail how this movement of translation works. It involves making the participants behave the way we need them to, what Calon calls enrollment, and making it difficult for other alternative associations to succeed, what Calon calls interestment. Here I want to show how this was done in Trafalgar Square. To begin with, we must remember that Ken Livingstone wanted Trafalgar Square to be a place where people could enjoy cultural activities proper to their contemporary modern human condition, meet with friends for coffee, celebrate London's multicultural diversity, walk comfortably and in safety, have an iconic experience of what being in London is, and thereby become world-class citizens, an exercise by which, in turn, the square and the city would become world-class square and world-class city. And so it was in the pursuit of this visualization of the square that the lifts, the cafe, the toilets, the staircases, the furniture, the lighting, and the cultural program repopulated the square, whilst the buses and the taxis were removed and the north side of the square pedestrianized. It was this way that the GLA and Mayor Livingstone could ensure the materialization of performativity of their vision for the square. However, the presence of pigeons disrupted these performances of humanity, culture, and civility. The pigeons were an obstacle, a threat to the culturing of Trafalgar Square, and therefore needed keeping out of the assemblage. In other words, the pigeons, the seed seller, and those who wanted to feed the birds performed through their practices another Trafalgar Square, one that competed with the GLAs, and that is also reminding of Anne-Marie Moll's arguments in The Body Multiple. And thus, Mayor Livingstone and the GLA concentrated on excluding the pigeons from their blueprint for the square. Hence, to impede these competing associations, several more objects were introduced as interestment devices, whilst several others were removed. Indeed, whilst the by-law, the metal signs, the heritage wardens, the hawk and its handler were introduced, the feed stall, the seed seller, and his license were removed, and any other possibility of feeding the birds was precluded. In turn, committed to another protocol for becoming human, the pigeons' advocates set themselves to interfere with the consolidation of the GLA's assemblage. The four otherwise unnoticed lines that physically demark the administrative boundary between Westminster Council and the GLA were politicized in order to circumvent the bylaw and the £50 fine threat. And so the activists invited everybody to feed the pigeons on the Westminster Council side of the square. At the same time, against the exclusion of the seed seller and against the prohibition of feeding the pigeons, the campaigners brought kilos and kilos of seeds that they spread on the surface of the square to subvert the GLA's intentions. Moreover, the pro-pigeon campaigners placed themselves, literally, on the square, and also enlisted the support, physical and discursive, of public figures like the late Tony Banks and Carla Lane in opposing the consolidation of the GLA's spatial and performative assemblage. The first rather obvious point that I want to stress here is that these competing interventions exemplify the hybrid and heterogeneous, mixed and messy character of the world and the practices through which we make it. First, both assemblages involve the social participation of non-humans, animals and objects, and so demonstrate the socio-natural character of reality. But also, and this is a second point I want to make about hybridity, because plenty of these enrolling and interestment devices are hybrids themselves. The signs in the square go hand in hand with the heritage wardens. The hawk is one with its handler, and so is the seller with its seeds or the volunteers with theirs. A third point is that objects were not only interposed as a way of fostering or deterring performances, they were also removed in order to dismantle other competing associations. Somewhere else in the dissertation, I go back to this point about removing objects and dismantling associations. For now, I want to relate this placement and displacement of objects, which in effect generates a spatiality, both in metaphorical and material terms, to the issue of power, because to say it in Calonne's words, and I quote, "The repertoire of translation is not only designed to give a symmetrical and tolerant description of a complex process which constantly mixes together a variety of social and natural entities. It also permits an explanation of how a few obtain the right to express and to represent the many silent actors of the social and natural worlds they have mobilized." End of the quote on page 19 of his 1986 article. In first instance, I want to underline the emergent, heterogeneous, dispersed and fragmentary character of power. Indeed, power emerges as an effect of the hybrid associations established between, for example, the GLA and the hawk, or the GLA and the metal signs of the square. The power to discourage pigeons from dwelling on the square, the power to legally enforce the square as a pigeon-free space, the power to determine who can be at and what can be done on the square. But it also emerges, and thus it is dispersed and fragmentary, through the association between their campaigners and their thousands of kilos of seeds, or between the activists and the 4 lines carved on the square, to delimit the administrative frontier between the GLA and Westminster Council. Power to encourage pigeons to dwell on the square, power to retain the square as a place where you can feed the pigeons, power to oppose the GLA's prescriptions about being and doing on the square. Moreover, it emerges not only in the fastening of relations, it is also affected through the intersecting of competitive associations, through the rupturing of associations. For example, the out-of-court agreement and the compensation payment that the seed seller received succeeded in enrolling him into the GLA's preferred assemblage. The rupturing of the association between pigeons, seeds, and feeders was performed not only by the introduction of the bylaw, but also by the hoovers that removed the seeds as they were being scattered by the campaigners. Now, to make a second point with regards to power, it is important to remember that one of the criticisms made to relational thinking concerns its alleged political flatness. Scholars like Noel Castry, Donna Haraway, and Steve Hinchliffe have expressed their concern that a relational understanding of power as emergent disregards the unequal powers that some actants seem to have over others. Admittedly, from the translations I have traced, it would appear that the mayor concentrated much greater power than the rest of the actants. However, extending the network in time shows that Livingstone's plans for Trafalgar Square emerged through other sets of relations. The faculties and powers of the GLA emerge from the legislative and executive processes of creating the GLA and establishing the democratically elected figure of the Mayor of London. In other words, such powers were given to the GLA and the Mayor by Parliament and Whitehall. But in turn, this was possible because the constitutional monarchy endowed them both with political and administrative responsibilities with regards to the management of Crown land that is also public space. So what I want to argue is that it is precisely through participating in, by flowing through various assemblages, that the Mayor and the GLA emerge as powerful. Ken Livingstone and the GLA become more powerful because they carry power that has emerged from other relations. Parliament invested it with nominal powers over Trafalgar Square, and in turn, Parliament's power emanates from its relationship with citizens. Londoners invested Livingstone with their power when they elected him. The bylaw carries the government's power, and these multiple powers carry on flowing through the heritage wardens, the signs, the hawk, the letter informing the seed seller that his license would not be renewed. In other words, extending the exercise of tracing translations and acknowledging the multiplicity of networks through which actants take shape makes it possible to think of power as made rather than had, and as fluid and topological instead of solid and concentrated. Moreover, this approach to power makes the argument for ontological symmetry whilst recognizing differences in power. Indeed, the exercise of extending in time the scope of translations reveals not only the mechanics of power, but also reconciles them with ontological symmetry, insofar as Mayor Livingstone, as much as the non-humans in the assemblage, appears too as a carrier of power. They all emerge as interestment or enrolling devices through which to accomplish assemblages, fix identities, and configure the world. The translations hereby traced reconcile the social agency of actants and the ontological symmetry of humans and non-humans with an analysis of unequal relationships of power. The issue of ontological flatness does not necessarily imply blindness to the workings of power. Symmetry not need mean disregarding the politics. This possibility, however, is conditional to a reconceptualization of time within relational thinking. Relational analysis that focus on the contingency of the here and now may miss the relevance of the there and then. Finally, there is another point I want to draw out from these translations with regards to power and objects. I want to further conceptualize this intrinsically geographical practice of placing and displacing objects as a way of establishing relations through which power is effected. John Law refers to it as making present, and Calonne as mobilization, both again geographical metaphors. The word I want to use to conceptualize this practice is articulate. To mobilize, place or displace objects articulates relationships of power. And I choose this word because it means to express, speak fluently and coherently, and also to join, to connect. Indeed, objects, human and not, allow actants to speak through them in the manner that the GLA speaks and enacts its power through the bylaw, the hawk, or the heritage wardens, for example. But they also allow them to speak for others in the way that the GLA, and this too enacts power, speaks for the parliament, for the government, and for the electorate, as it carries and circulates their voices. Likewise, the campaigners spoke through their seats, their demonstrations, banners, and megaphones, whilst arguably speaking for the tourists and British visitors to the square that still wanted the traditional experience of feeding the pigeons in Trafalgar, or for the bird feeders and the animal activists who wished to enact an alternative protocol for becoming human. More importantly, the campaigners were speaking for and representing the pigeons, who had no voice and no place in the GLA's world-making. And so what I want to contend is this. Despite their differences on the question of removing the pigeons from Trafalgar Square, the alternative protocols of actions of Ken Livingstone and the GLA on the one hand, and the campaigners on the other, both enacted a modernity that, however multiple and contested, also depended on various heterogeneous assemblages whose hybridity was denied by their respective appeals to a sanitized space for multicultural human celebration, and to the virtues of human kindness and compassion for animals. These performances of modernity also reveal a lot about how animals are mixed in our politics, and also about our politics for mixing or not with animals.